Hi there, this is Helen Tarrant again from Outgoing. Here with our whole team. Wow, it's massive. Welcome to another episode of Commercial Property Roadshow. You're here with Helen Tarrant, and today I'm going to talk about outgoings in commercial property. Now, a lot of people think about outgoings as the enemy. They think that you've got to reduce your outgoings, that because you're coming from residential, you're thinking, okay, how much am I up for this property? Now, in commercial, your tenant pays for the outgoings. How much the outgoings they pay for depends on the lease. And if you're incoming, as in you're the incoming purchaser, you can't renegotiate a property that's already has a lease on it with what the tenant is paying. Now, your vendor may, or your landlord, the previous landlord, who you're buying from, may not be charging the tenant outgoings, even though under the lease they could be. But they may have forgotten. They may have felt that it's more equitable not to charge them. They may find that their rent was out over market, and they decide not to charge them to make it more equitable. Or it could be just COVID, and they decide to give the tenant a break. Right? Whatever the reason. Doesn't mean that you need to carry that on. When you are the landlord, you obviously can charge everything that they allow you to charge under the lease. So make sure you read the lease document. But the other thing about outgoings is that there is a standard outgoing, such as your water, your council, your either strata or property insurance. So if you have a freestanding property, it's insurance. If you have a strata property, it's the strata fees, which will have insurance already part of it, as well as your maintenance fund, which is for capital works, as well as for your admin fund to run the property, right? So these are your 3 or 4 basic statutory, mandatory outgoings for commercial property. Now, they're going to be a little bit higher when you're in a high-rise building. So the higher the building, more high-rises, it's going to be a bit more higher for you. The warehouse properties are going to be the lowest in terms of strata outgoings because there's really nothing to maintain, right? A bit of gardening and a bit of just checking on the roof, bit of the compliance in terms of your fire compliance, electricals and plumbing and things like that. So it's going to be cheaper. Your retail shop fronts, depending on how big the complex is, the strata may be more or maybe less. And then you've got your rates. And your rates, depending on where you are, there's going to be areas where the rates and the outgoings are just naturally high. There's nothing you can do about it. It's just where it is. Now, most people are worried about what happens when your tenant considers your outgoings in comparison to someone else. Now, the downside of having higher outgoings is that your tenants, when they consider your premise with someone else's premise, they may choose a premise that has less outgoings. So because they're paying the outgoings, less cost for them. However, if you're in a key location with good traffic and thoroughfare, your outgoings are going to be high. Right, so if you're in the centre of Sydney CBD, you're in Brisbane Metro, you're in key locations on the Gold Coast or Central Coast, your strata property is going to be high. Potentially your insurance is going to be high as well because of the building type and also the tenant that's in there as well. So that you can't avoid. And if you want to buy in those key locations, that is the high price of outgoings. And your tenant will want to be in that location and they have to pay those outgoings. So again, there's not much else they can do about it, right? So having said that, your outgoings, apart from these, there's 2 other ones that are usually in contention with your tenant. Sometimes they're more than happy to pay for it. Sometimes they're not. So number 1 is that the management fees, and number 2 is land tax. Now, most tenants don't want to pay for land tax unless you're in Victoria, which land tax threshold is lower and the tenant expects to pay land tax. So that becomes more a run-of-the-mill standard practice. But if you're in New South Wales, or especially if you're in Queensland, tenants hate paying land tax because they can avoid it, right? They can avoid paying land tax by you holding it in a different structure. But if you choose to lump everything together, the tenant doesn't see why they need to pay land tax with your land tax, right? So the tenant's very sensitive to that. Management fees, a lot of tenants are worried about how much management fees is. So if you're going to give them an idea of it and you're not going to go exorbitant amount of management fees, most tenants are okay. The only time a tenant will not be okay is when they have one single tenancy and they feel like you could just send them an invoice. They always pay you. Why are they paying an additional $2,000 or $3,000, or it could be potentially $5,000 a year for someone to manage a property that they're never going to default on rent, never complain about any of the issues on the property. Why do they have to pay you that, right? So that's another issue in contention. Now, I feel that management fees, depending on the tenant and depending on how you see it, manager fees you can take on yourself and absorb, because you can self-manage a commercial property relatively easily if you want to. And it depends on distance of where you are. So if you're based in Sydney, you're buying in Rockhampton, in Townsville or Bundaberg, I would get someone local to manage it. If I was buying in Melbourne and I was located in Melbourne, I could easily manage it myself, right? If I buy something in Sydney, or even Central Coast or Newcastle, I can probably manage that myself. Whether I want to or not is entirely up to me or you in this circumstance. But that's really your major outgoings. Now, what stems on from there is a few different ones that goes on to repair and maintenance, your general wear and tear, and also things like incidentals, such as phone calls that you might make to the tenant, or the property manager might make to the tenant. Might be things like additional accounting costs, might be things like additional inspection costs or auditing, or any of those things that is not ordinarily part of outgoings. So what outgoings typically is in a commercial property is all of the major ones that you can think of that comes out of your pocket, all the incidental ones like your own accounting for the structure you bought the property. The tenant will not pay for that. Things like, if you have travel expenses to see the tenant, or if you have to do additional audit costs or additional costs you have to pay the property manager to organize things and trades, or any of the things you want to need to do for the tenant. Sometimes property managers charge you that. Sometimes they don't. But if you have to do all of that, then the tenant don't feel like they have to pay for it. Now, on certain kind of leases, if they're really national tenants, they will pay for things like that, but ordinarily they won't. So it's not an outgoing you can charge onto your tenant. The other thing is it come to a point where sometimes there is the rent review costs or option take-up fee. So typically an agent will charge you 50% of their leasing fee to get the tenant to take up their option. And it's not just about writing to the tenant and get the tenants to take up their option. It's actually about negotiation with a tenant and getting them to stay for longer, whether it's an extra 3 years or 5 years, and really adding that value to your property. And you should pay a leasing agent for that. And in fact, you should incentivize the leasing agent to get onto it earlier, so you have more security in your property, because it's all about security at the end of the day for you. And that's why you invest in commercial property. Of course, there is then, you might have some additional fees that entails, like, if you're doing a rental increase, there should be no additional fees. But if any kind of negotiations, sometimes these things pop up. And then during the run of the mill, there will be some maintenance costs. Some of them your tenant will take care of, like air conditioning servicing. Your tenant's responsibility to take care of that. So it's an outgoing, but it's more like a repairs and maintenance outgoing. So then your tenant takes care of that. But the capital works of the air conditioning unit, that's yours. If it breaks, you need to pay for it. It's not part of general wear and tear, is a capital of nature, so you have to pay for it. And typically, if your tenant do pay for it, it's for things they additionally installed as they fit out. So if you provided 3 air conditioning units, but your tenant needed 5, they put in an extra 2. If the extra 2 breaks, then they pay for that too. So that's why that's the difference. Now, going on from there, that's pretty much wraps up all of your maintenance costs. There might be some general ones like mowing the lawn, taking care of going and checking, getting the gutters clean, checking any awnings, any of the roof. You do want to get the roof checked once in a while, so you want to make sure it's your biggest cost in commercial property. You want to make sure that's taken care of properly. You want to, get your aircon checked once in a while, just so that it's going well, or you want the tenant to send you the servicing report. But things like gardening and everything, typically if you have one tenant, one property, and we have a property like that in Wodonga, where it's got a grass area and an out area for the tenant to eat lunch, and a parking area, the tenant actually takes care of all of that. So they take care of that, maintaining the gardens and everything else. So that's sort of no need for you to do it. But if you have a multi-tenant property, which I have a multi-tenant property as well, I have to take care of the gardening. I have to take care of the cleaning of the common toilets, and I have to take care of the common area electricity area. So when you have a multi-tenant, there's going to be a little bit more outgoings where you can't really charge it to the tenant. It just comes off the rent, and you still get a net figure when you do come to selling it or when you come to buying it. But just be aware that those are things that you can't pass on to the tenant. But mostly if you have one tenant, the bulk of outgoings can be charged to the tenant. If you have a multi-tenant, a portion of it won't be able to be charged to the tenant, and you will have to take on those outgoings. So that's the major difference of having single tenant versus multi-tenant, which is also why for some people they like to have single tenant who takes care of everything. For some people they like multi-tenant for the security of having multiple tenants in case one leaves. They're never short of an income. So that decision is entirely up to you, and perhaps you'll make that decision when we come to a strategy session together and you can work out what you want to do going forward. In fact, I think now with outgoings, that's pretty much everything. The only other thing I would talk about now is the make good clause, because it comes to the end of your lease. So when your tenant have finished their term with you, they want to actually leave, these are some of the things that they need to finish with you, and that a lot of it has to do with outgoings. So what do they classify as wear and tear? What do they classify as repair and maintenance? Have they done things like pest control if they, let's say that, they were in the food business, a good clean of the property, good servicing, in good service order of your air conditioning? Have they, added 3-phase power, or have they put something in the property where when they remove it, it's going to be a cost? If that is a cost, it's not technically an outgoing, it's a once-off cost, but again, it's a cost on the property. The tenant should be paying for that. You don't pay for that. You can monitor that to make sure, or get your property manager to monitor that to make sure that is all paid for. Now, again, this comes back to having effective property managers or asset managers where they grow the value of your property. Managing that transition is really, really important. Managing the incoming of a new tenant is really important, and managing exactly what your tenant is paying for in terms of outgoings is also really important as well. So you need really good asset managers, and we typically assess an area. We typically find out how difficult or what you need to do during the due diligence process if you're a client of ours, and then we advise the right property manager for you. So again, if this is something you're looking for, someone to work with you hand in hand to create a passive income portfolio that you can retire on through commercial property, then reach out to us, helentarrant.com, unicorn.com.au. This is Helen Tarrant from Unicorn Commercial Property. We're here to build a long-term relationship with you, passive income through commercial property, and ultimately helping you to retire faster and better through it. But all of that surrounds strategy and partnership and working together to achieve that common goal. So reach out to us, link down there if you need it, and let me know what other topics you want me to cover in my videos. And I look forward to seeing you in one of my boot camps or at the City Expo coming up. Bye for now.